And welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian. I'm just going to position the camera a little bit less awkwardly. We are live on both Instagram and YouTube as of right now. Hello! Today we're going to be talking about the Barbie movie, specifically Barbie and philosophy and psychoanalysis. If you're new to this is a weekly live stream philosophy and theory session that I've been hosting for the past 2.5 years. And if you're a complete beginner, you are welcome to join me. There's no previous knowledge required. And I also wanted to very briefly say thank you to everybody who last week purchased the Complete Guide to Žižek ebook, which I was very happy to release last week. It's the culmination of the last 2 years worth of lectures. For those of you who've been following for a long time, every 3 months I would release an accompanying ebook. And at the end of 2 years, I decided to release all of them together in a complete revised edition titled The Complete Guide to Žižek. And I'm so completely thrilled and happy that so many of you have decided to purchase this book. It brings me a lot of joy knowing that the work is appreciated and that there is an audience for this very niche philosophical interest. Above all, I hope that the book will prove useful in your own learning and study, and it's good motivation for me to keep on going. So, little housekeeping is that next week, starting next Monday, I'm going to be starting an entirely new lecture series. For those of you who are curious what the lecture series is going to be, it is going to be called The Cunning of Reason. And the cunning of reason is a reference to the Hegelian concept Die List der Vernunft, which is simply the German for the cunning of reason. So that's going to be starting next week. That's going to be a 3-month series in which we do a deep dive into Hegelian dialectics. And if you'd like to join me for that, the lectures remain entirely, completely open access and free, and that's going to be starting next Monday. However, since we've just wrapped up a 2-year-long intense lecture series, I thought that instead of diving into the next one immediately, it might be fun if we take a week to do something else. And since I've just recently seen the new Barbie movie by Greta Gerwig, I thought it would be fun to dedicate a single live stream to talking about Barbie, critiquing Barbie, analyzing Barbie from the perspective of philosophy and psychoanalysis. And so if you'd like to join me for a 45-minute lecture that is dedicated entirely to Barbie, you are welcome to stay around. I'm also going to be talking about Oppenheimer and a little bit more about Barbie in the post-lecture Q&A discussion, which I'll be hosting for patrons and Substack subscribers immediately after this lecture. And so if you'd like to talk more about Barbie and Oppenheimer and the relationship between the two, you can join me on the bonus discussion afterwards. I also want to say a huge thank you to the patrons who continue to support this project. It's incredible that I get to essentially host these open access theory and philosophy sessions more than 2 years since I left academia. That is entirely due to you. So thank you so much for supporting my dream of making philosophy and theory accessible for everyone and allowing me to keep working and researching and teaching on the topics that I find to be fascinating. So thank you to the patrons who make this project possible in the first place. And please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. I derive so much satisfaction from knowing where you guys are joining me from. The fact that we are a global connected community of like-minded thinkers really is the reason why I get up every Monday morning for the past almost 3 years by now. Good morning to Brazil. I see Rio, Brazil. Good morning, bon dia, or bon dia. Is that how you say it in Brazil? I'm not quite sure. Kiev, Ukraine. Hello, Ukraine. Solidarity with you. Canada. Hello, Canada. Perth. I almost went to Canada to see an Oppenheimer screening because there's so many more IMAX 70mm screenings in Canada than there are on this side of the country. Brazil, Germany. Hello, Germany. Serbia. Hello, Serbia. Sunny California, Mexico City. And if you're wondering where I am, I'm currently in overcast, rainy Seattle, because it wouldn't be Seattle if it weren't raining in the beginning of August. And of course, that's how we like it here. That's how we sort of get to justify staying indoors and reading books and watching movies. I am currently in Seattle. I'm going to be here for a couple more weeks, and I am going to make my way over to the European continent, where I'll be doing a Euro tour this fall and winter. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, everybody, for letting me know where you're joining me from. I see the Netherlands. I see Czech Republic. That's wonderful. Okay, and yes, obviously solidarity with those Russian citizens who are doing hopefully their best under these circumstances. Okay, let us begin. As I said before, this is going to be a one-off lecture where we talk exclusively about Barbie. And then next week, we're going to launch into a new lecture series titled The Cunning of Reason, or Die List der Vernunft. And I want to start by saying something about Barbie, which is that I enjoyed it very much. I thought it was a really excellent movie. I thought it was very thought-provoking. I thought it was well-written. I thought it was intelligent. And no, I did not have any qualms about the fact that it was a Mattel production. That some of the more cynical responses I saw pointed out that, well, you know, this is the stage of capitalism that we're in right now, where even the critique of consumption and Barbie and capitalism has to take place under the banner of further promoting those consumer products as such. And I actually don't see the problem in that necessarily. I think that's a contradiction that is perfectly poignant to the moment that we're living in. In fact, if they're going to give you money to buy the rope with which you hang them, you should take that money. And so in this video, I want to talk a little bit about the intersections between Barbie, philosophy, theory, and psychoanalysis. In fact, there's something that Žižekian said, and he said it a couple of times, that has caused a lot of confusion that we see perfectly in this movie, which is that Žižekian said that man is simply a woman who believes she exists. And perhaps, and spoilers for Barbie, you could say that at the end of this movie, this is exactly what we see in Ken. That Ken's tautological, joyful insight that Ken is me is therefore simply the man who is a woman who believes that she exists. All that and more I will try to explain in the coming lecture. Now, the movie starts with a perfect illustration of how ideology functions. In the beginning of the movie, we see Barbie Land, in which everything is perfect. Everything is happy. To put it in the terms of the Lego movie, everything is awesome. And Barbie is living this pristine, perfect, glamorous, happy, fulfilled life. Essentially, Barbie is living like a psychotic. She is fully submersed in the fantasy that is her reality. And there's no disconnect, there's no tension in this reality. She fits seamlessly into the fantasy, which is her reality. In other words, there's a perfect, if you will, alignment between the fantasy that supplements her reality, by which she accesses the reality, to put it in Lacanian terms. After all, one of Lacan's maxims is that we only access reality through fantasy. However, what's key here is that this immersion, in order to be complete, requires one thing that is, let's say, detached from it. Now, what is that one thing for Barbie? Well, the reason Barbie is happy, the reason she is fulfilled and living in this completely beautiful psychotic state, is because she believes in the corporate ideology of Barbie. What is the corporate ideology of Barbie? Well, it's that Barbie has solved the problems of feminism, that Barbie has liberated and emancipated women in the real world, and that therefore Barbie stands as a kind of pinnacle of human achievement. Hence the sort of duplicitous, almost dialectical, ethical obligation that Barbie has. One, she is happy because she has saved women, but secondly, she has to continue to be happy because by means of being happy and perfect, she is saving women in her very symbolic function. Now, this one excessive thing, this one thing that stands outside Barbie, is what holds the fantasy together, which is I am perfect because my perfection liberates other women. And what's key here is that this is how all ideology functions. All ideology has to have one thing that stands outside of it, a kind of part of no part, if you will, that stitches it together. And think about it, for example, even from the perspective of Nazi ideology. Nazi ideology required the figure of the Jew in order to stitch together the entire phantasmatic frame of the Reich. And the figure of the Jew was therefore precisely not the historical reality of different Jewish identities, but the universal signifier of the Jew. Think about how Primo Levi, for example, wrote that one of the horrific insights he had in one of the concentration camps was precisely that there was no such thing as the Jew. That in the camp, he discovered that not only did they speak different languages and often couldn't understand themselves, like a Polish Jew wouldn't be able to understand a North Italian Jew, but that fundamentally, ideologically, and professionally, they were completely different people. And that the notion of the Jew was creation of the Nazi fantasy, the one excessive, fantastical thing that had to exist in order to uphold the frame of reference of the Nazi ideology. Now, of course, there's a difference between Barbie, where her idea of the universal woman who is happy because of me is antithetical to the Nazi idea of the Jew is everywhere lurking, we have to find him, etc. And yet, fundamentally, the logic functions in the same way, which is to say that there's one thing that exists outside the fantasy frame that nevertheless is what upholds it from within. And this is how, again, all ideology works. Ideology isn't simply the complete psychotic immersion in one's belief. It's that there's always something antithetical to it that nevertheless becomes woven back into the fabric of its completion. This is something that I think we struggle to comprehend, for example, when it comes to discussions about quote-unquote post-truth, etc., which is that often we think that if people exist in like a conspiratorial mindset, that if we simply present them with the facts, that they will change their mind. Whereas what tends to happen in this immersion in a conspiratorial belief and worldview is that even the things that contradict your worldview become embedded within the worldview as such. And this is what's really important about ideology, is that ideology doesn't function as a complete immersion system because it is completely lacking contradiction. It is exactly the other way around. The more contradictory it is, the more immersive it becomes. And here, and I've mentioned this before, this is the well-known anecdote that Sartre has about psychosis, about a woman who says that she keeps receiving calls from God. Now, she goes to a psychotherapist and says, I keep receiving calls from God. And the psychotherapist says to her at a certain point, that's not possible. God does not exist. You can't be receiving calls from him. And her response, of course, is beautiful here, which is to say, I know, that's what I keep telling him. And this is exactly the psychotic immersion of ideology. It's not simply a complete slavish belief in the fantasy frame. It's that even your disbelief, even the thing that stands outside of it, becomes completely integrated and woven back into it. And so the psychotic stance for Sartre, but also for Lacan, is therefore, and there's not always very much overlap between Sartre and Lacan, let me be clear. The psychotic stance is therefore not, I believe completely in God and in the perfection of the divine will and plan. It's, I don't believe in God, but he still keeps calling me on the phone and I can't convince him he doesn't exist. That is how ideology functions on a psychotic level, is that even the disbelief becomes woven back into it. Slavoj Žižek actually has a really good joke about this that he repeats quite frequently. And it's a man who is very reasonable, a man of science, who does not believe in superstition. And at a certain point, one of his scientific friends comes over to his house and he's surprised to see that there's like a horseshoe above his door frame. And he says to the scientist, he says, I thought you were a scientist. Why would you have a door frame above your a horseshoe above your door? Don't you know that it doesn't work? And the scientist's response is, oh yes, I know that it doesn't work, but I've been told that it works even if you don't believe in it. And this, it works even if you don't believe in it, is precisely Žižek's point, is that disbelief, rather than being antithetical to belief, is in fact a core constitutive element of it. Of course, the full quote-unquote psychotic immersion within the incentive structures of capitalism and the consumer society functions according to the same principle. You participate not because you fully believe that capitalism is the best system, or like Churchill once said, you know, apropos democracy, that it is the worst but not as bad as the others. It's that fundamentally you don't believe in it, and yet you participate nevertheless. That people who go and vote, for example, for a radical ideological leader don't necessarily do it because they're their biggest supporter, but because they feel like they've seen through it and that everybody else is the dupe who is voting for them. That the primary requirement for participation in an ideological fantasy frame isn't full belief or adherence, but precisely that it allows you some minimal level of detachment. And this is something that I think we see in the beginning of the Barbie movie, which is that Barbie lives in this complete psychotic fantasy land, Barbie land, and yet the reason that she participates in it is because she is doing it on behalf of the other, on behalf of women, because her perfection emancipates and liberates women. And so in a sense, Barbie has an ethical obligation to be perfect. That is the reason that she exists. Now, that's already an interesting way to begin framing the movie, to my mind at least. And of course, everybody who has seen the film knows what happens next, which is that Barbie has intrusive thoughts of death. And then, of course, an awareness of physical reality, of physical decomposition through cellulitis. The two, and this is of course an ironic almost joke, which is that the thing that everybody fears is death, and that the thing that women fear more than death is cellulitis, etc. Now, what the movie does really, really well, and there's so many levels on which I think it actually succeeds in a very intelligent manner. What the movie does very well is that it introduces Barbie and Ken as, of course, being dolls, as being sexless, as having plastic blobs instead of genitals. And here we can see, in perfect cinematic form, the Lacanian argument about the phallus. And the Lacanian argument about the phallus is that the phallus is not the biological organ of reproduction. Instead, the phallus is the imaginary phallus through which we have attachment to the symbolic order. In a sense, what Lacan is saying simply is to radicalize the idea of the castration complex. This is what Lacan does over and over again. Is he takes a Freudian concept and then he radicalizes it by seemingly doing something opposite. The idea of the castration complex, as I've said many times before, I think even like as recently as 2 weeks ago, to my mind can always be exemplified as being the opposite of the phantom limb syndrome. Now, whilst the phantom limb syndrome is clearly a clinical concept and has nothing to do with psychoanalysis, the principle holds true. The phantom limb syndrome is that you have lost a limb, but fundamentally it feels like it's still there. You're missing an arm, but you can still feel the presence of the arm. The idea of the castration complex is the exact opposite. It's that the thing is not there. That the thing is there, but it feels like it's not. In other words, the physical thing is there, the organ of reproduction, and yet it has been castrated symbolically. It has not been made manifest. It is a stand-in for nothing. It is lost as its own object. Now, that might seem unnecessarily abstract, so let's try to fill that in a little bit. No pun intended. Essentially, what Lacan is arguing is that the phallus is therefore the symbolic function of the physical organ of reproduction, which is not the manifestation of its strength, but precisely the manifestation or the filling in of its impotence. The fact that it does not stand on its own. Again, no pun intended. Hence also why the quote, which is usually attributed to Oscar Wilde, which is also very Freudian, is everything is about sex, except sex, which is about something else. And this is the problem of the phallus, which is that everything phallic is meant to represent or fill in the absence or gap within the phallus itself. That phallus is a signifier that cannot represent itself. And so if everything represents phallus, then what does phallus represent? And the radical Lacanian conclusion, which Žižek often refers to, is therefore, what does phallus represent? Phallus equals woman. In other words, woman is the phallic function of the symbolic. And this is like kind of it's a crazy idea to wrap your head around, so we have to take it step by step. Which is to say, if the physical organ of reproduction lacks in and of itself, in other words, it has to be symbolically upheld through the phallic function, in other words, through the imaginary attachment to the phallus, then if everything is phallus, then the one thing that is not phallus becomes the ultimate fulfillment of phallus. What is the one thing that is not phallus? It is, of course, female. And this is for Freud, the shocking discovery that man has, that woman is lacking the male sex organ. And therefore, woman becomes complete, whereas man remains incomplete. Now, this is very technical psychoanalytic stuff, but we can see it almost perfectly rendered in the Barbie movie. First of all, we have the idea that Barbie and Ken are strictly speaking sexless, that where the sex organ should be, there is nothing. And yet Barbie and Ken yet nevertheless remain completely caught in the symbolic impossibility of their interrelationship. Here we can actually see, like in a very literal sense, Lacan's formula of sexuation, which is that there is no sexual relationship. When Lacan says there is no sexual relationship, he's not simply pointing out that there's no yin and yang, female, male correspondence of perfect harmony through intercourse, but precisely that, strictly speaking, the male-female relationship is revolving around the problem of sex, which is the problem of its own supplementation through the symbolic order and the attachment to the imaginary function of the phallus. And that's what Lacan is therefore arguing, is that woman is phallus. That, and this is completely antithetical to, I think, how a lot of people interpret the idea of the theory of sexuation, which is to say, it's not that woman has to release herself from phallic control in order to be true woman. It's that woman represents phallus. In other words, woman represents that which is lacking in man. Hence also Žižek's argument that a man is a woman who believes she exists. A man has to uphold the idea of female completeness, in fact, even the idea of female divinity, in order to make up for the symbolic lack within himself, the lack of phallus. And so the idea of woman is therefore a male fantasy. But this creates a problem for woman, of course, which is, what is woman? In fact, the central feminist question, which Barbie beautifully engages with, which is, what is woman in itself? What is woman for herself? And this is also the key question of psychoanalysis. Now, from a Žižekian perspective, this is precisely why woman is true subject. Žižek has always favored the idea of female subjectivity in its hysterical notion, which I'll explain in a moment, over the male fantasy of tautological identification with his self. We're doing so much here, I feel like I need to take it back a little bit for those who are sort of just entering into this idea. So let's go back to the question, which is the feminine question, which is, what is woman in itself? What is woman in herself? Now, one of the problems that feminism runs into, and the feminist question runs into, is that if the idea of female identity is only framed in terms of avoiding male cliches, in other words, avoiding objectification by the man, then woman invariably runs into a problem, which is that even those ideas of femininity, which are juxtaposed to the male cliches, remain nevertheless part and parcel to male cliche. If we think of woman as sex object, male cliche, and we then reverse it into woman is in fact motherly and kind and caring, then we're back in male gaze, male cliche. In fact, the Barbie movie points this out quite perfectly in the list of contradictions about woman. There's a beautiful speech where all the contradictory aspects of what is woman are sort of listed, and one of them is, a man wants a woman to be both mother and lover. He wants her to be both sexy and prude, etc. That woman exists in this impossible relationship towards man, which is necessarily entirely contradictory, so that man can uphold his own fantastical belief in his own unitary being. In fact, that without woman as the idealized subject, man cannot exist. In fact, this is the problem that Ken faces in the movie, right? Which is that the question, what is woman, has to be supplemented by the question, what is Ken? And Ken is nothing without woman to perform before. In fact, this is the central aspect of the idea of chivalry, which I covered a couple of weeks ago, is that chivalry upholds the idea of the impossible woman, of the woman who can never actually be reached. As Kafka once said, something which you place so high above you that you can never access it. And yet precisely by placing woman on this pedestal of ultimate idealized femininity, it means that man can exist in his full masculine macho function, competing with other men to win the favor of the princess. And that therefore masculinity is accessed only at the cost of elevating femininity into this unreachable, non-traversable horizon of being. And so, of course, the question, what is woman for man, becomes woman is the unattainable object, which is nevertheless pure, that retroactively allows me to believe in myself. There's a beautiful scene about this in the television series Peep Show years ago, which was on the BBC, in which one character, a male, is struggling with self-confidence. And his friend says, well, what you have to do is you have to believe in yourself. Well, how do you believe in yourself? He says, every morning you get up and you look in the mirror. And when you look in the mirror, I want you to say to yourself, you, the man. And then I want you to say, I, the man. And then I want you to say to yourself, I'm the man, I'm the man, I'm the man, until you start believing it. Now, in a beautiful comedic inversion of this logic, the man gets up in the morning, goes into his bathroom, looks in the mirror. Instead of saying, I'm the man, he says, I'm a man. And then he starts saying it louder, I'm a man, I'm a man, I'm a man. And the more he says it, the more ludicrous it becomes, because of course, there's a difference between the idea of being the singular man versus being a man amongst other men. By definition, the idea of masculinity is therefore tied to the idea of being the singular man who rises above all other men. And how do you rise above all other men? You do it in pursuit of competition of the woman. And so the problem for Ken is precisely the same problem, which is, am I the Ken or am I a Ken? And to be a Ken is therefore to be, in a sense, emasculated, to be not properly Ken because he is simply a Ken. And so the question for Ken is, how do I become the Ken? And the idea of being the Ken would therefore be the emancipation of Ken from the impossible situation of being universal Ken. And the only way to be the Ken is therefore to be the Ken for Barbie. And this is what's so important about the hysterical relationship that men therefore have apropos women, is that everything that they do is designed to draw attention from the woman to not validate man, but to prove that man exists. And of course, what is better suited to getting the attention of woman? It's not to idolize her simply, but it's to make her afraid. This is like the funny thing about catcalling. Catcalling, if you look at it, is if the purpose of catcalling is to make the woman be a potential mate or partner, then clearly it's designed to fail. It's very unlikely that catcalling will induce a woman to say, yes, I want to be with you. In fact, the ultimate way for women to neuter the power of catcalling is precisely to hear its call and to return the address. There's videos about this on YouTube where women walk through the street and they're being catcalled by men. And then they turn around and aggressively begin to flirt back at the man. And it's exact point that the man sort of shrinks and shrivels and becomes afraid of the woman. Because the whole point of catcalling isn't to invite the woman into reciprocity. The whole point is to keep woman down, to keep her small. It's a great scene in Barbie where Barbie and Ken walk into the real world and they're on Venice Beach, and Barbie says, I feel self-conscious because all of a sudden everybody's looking at me as if I'm an object of desire, but there's always an undertone of violence here. In other words, the point isn't simply to have woman, the point is to be woman. Now, why would a man want to be a woman? That seems totally counterintuitive. It's to inhabit woman's completion. If man idealizes woman as ideal subject, then the point is not to simply have her. Then the point is to be her, to have that which is out of reach. And man is therefore caught in an impossible paradox or bind, which is that man, in order to believe in himself as unitary being, as the man, has to uphold the idea of an idealized ultimate universal femininity. However, if the woman is upheld as an idealized universal femininity, then woman has that which man is lacking. And so man wants to be woman. And yet man can only be man if he upholds woman as the impossible other to himself. Hence, when Žižek says that man is a woman who believes she exists, is that man simply wants to believe in himself in the manner in which he pauses full immersion in reality to woman. It's complicated, but I think also sort of interesting. Now, there's a couple things that we have to like extrapolate from this, and which we can do perhaps if we go back to the idea of Barbie. So Barbie essentially has a beautiful conception of not only ideology and Lacan's formula of sexuation, but specifically also about how how Barbie answers the question of what is Barbie in herself. Think about it here. Barbie's act of emancipation in the movie is to set other Barbies free by articulating the contradictions of their reality. In other words, what Barbie does is that she doesn't give them the answer. She doesn't tell them who they ought to be. She articulates, or the human sort of equivalent of Barbie, articulates the myriad contradictions of feminine subjectivity. You have to be both mother and wife. I mean, to the man, you have to be both sexy and prudish. You have to be both perfect and yet somehow idiotic and naive so that the man can instruct you. All the myriad contradictions of what it means to be womanhood are articulated, and then the women quite literally snap out of it in the movie. We see a moment where they go from being immersed within the new Ken patriarchy, which for those of you who have seen the movie will understand, and they suddenly see it with clarity. Now, what's important here is what they see with clarity is the impossibility of feminine subjectivity as such. And this is why Žižek upholds the idea of the feminine subject as being in some sense superior to the male subject, not in a competition of the sexes, which would be vulgar, but specifically that woman, in realizing that there is no resolution to these contradictions, that there is no way out, as it were, that woman therefore no longer aspires to be perfect woman or idealized femininity. Woman aspires to be the physical embodiment of this lack, of this nothing, of this difference. That female subjectivity is emancipated by embracing this negative space and protecting it. Whereas masculinity finds its emancipation in believing completely in the idea of male identity. Here we see two totally different movements. Female emancipation is femininity does not exist outside of the idealized substance, which is that male lack, which is projected back onto woman as universal ideal. And so female emancipation is not to be true woman, because this would imply a totally paradoxical tautological sequence. If the problem of the patriarchy is that woman is upheld as ideal substance, then the very desire to be true woman is itself the problem. This is beautifully articulated in Barbie, which is that Barbie begins as perfect woman. And the point is to become imperfect woman. And so femininity and the idea of female emancipation is to protect this gap, this dissonance, these contradictions, to uphold them as a sign of really existing woman. And so the question, what is woman in itself? What is woman for herself? Is therefore answered by the idea that woman is this gap. Woman is this impossibility. That is what the feminine identity is, and that is the liberating quality of it. The male emancipation, instead, is the man who can believe in himself without requiring woman. The man who can be man without having to project his lack back onto idealized woman. Hence, the liberating aspect of the Barbie movie at the end of the movie is that we see an ecstatic Ken sliding down a slide, yelling to himself, "Ken is me," over and over again. Ken is me. And therein, Ken is being liberated from his reliance on Barbie, from his reliance on woman in order to be Ken. And then we have the tautological sequence, which is Ken is me. In a sense, what happens at the end of the movie is that Ken becomes Barbie, fully immersed in the tautological sequence of I equals I, whereas Barbie becomes the proper subject, capital S, who is not I equals I, but I does not equal I. In other words, at the end of the movie, Barbie emerges as a true subject, a subject who inhabits and embraces the contradictions of being a woman. Whereas Ken's emancipation is to become Barbie, to become I is I. Ken equals me. And this joyous, ecstatic position that we see at the end of the movie is therefore, in a sense, male liberation at its purest. Men liberated from the necessity of idealizing woman and both oppressing her and fetishizing her in order to stage a performative masculinity which can never be properly achieved in the first place. In fact, Ken is here not the oppressive, patriarchal monster that we might otherwise see in some more vulgar accounts of feminism. Instead, Ken is the man who is stuck between his desire to simply be Ken and the necessity of performing his Kenness to Barbie, which, being unfulfilled, has to therefore be staged in an extreme competition with other Kens. And what's beautiful in the third act of the movie is that Barbie realizes that in order for Ken to be emancipated, Ken has to undergo this process. It's not simply that she can sit Ken down and explain to him the pitfalls of patriarchy. Instead, she withdraws or withholds feminine acceptance from Ken and makes it subject to other men, therefore leading to an enormous battle of all Kens against all other Kens. And in this moment of distraction, Barbie is then able to take back power, as it were. And here we see what, to my mind, is actually one of the key shortcomings of the movie, which is that at the end it posits a kind of ideological placeholder that explains this transition, which is a kind of liberal belief in democracy. In fact, it's very nonsensical. While the Kens are battling, the Barbies go and vote for another constitution. And it's not very clear what the constitution is, except the constitution enshrines matriarchal rights or something like this. Again, in a very bourgeois notion, the way in which these rights are then constituted is through property. Whether the houses are Barbie's dream houses or whether they're Ken's, casa, dojos, etc., right? Man caves, essentially. And so, what's in my mind beautiful, ironic twist, it's that the identity of Barbie versus Ken is fought out through the identity of their attachment to property and what the property signifies to them and who they are in those homes. Now, what's important here is that if you go back to the question, which I posited as being the central feminist question, which is what is woman in itself? Now, I say itself here and not herself because in itself means the essence of femininity is therefore not attached to any form of sexual identity, but to the problem of sexuation as such, which is the incompatibility or the impossibility of there being a sexual relation. For Lacan, il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel. And so the problem presents itself as what is woman in itself, and how can this in itself, in a perfectly Hegelian way, be posited as a for itself? And the way in which feminine subjectivity is posited for itself is, of course, for herself. And what does it mean for a woman to be for herself? It means to inhabit the impossibility of being woman, not seeking pure, authentic female subjectivity, but to go beyond this non-traversable horizon of the incompatibility of the sexes as such. And this is why I think it's so important that the movie doesn't actually pay homage to some sort of soft, politically correct notions of identity politics, at least not to my mind. It doesn't posit that Barbie's emancipation is simply to have more expressions of sexual identity, that Barbie can also be LGBTQ+, etc. It's to say that fundamentally the problem of LGBTQ+, by which I mean not the problem that it exists in a normatively bad fashion, but the problem of the idea of sexual identity being this spurious infinitive of a never-ending extended sequence of further, if you will, accessories or outfits, that the problem of sexual identity lies precisely within the originary primordial foundational problem of the incompatibility, the non-relationship between the sexes as such. That therefore the idea of sexual identification is not about finding one's true identity and returning back to it, but properly embracing the impossibility, the problem of sexuation as such. And that therefore Barbie's emancipation or liberation is not to be the true woman, the perfect woman, nor is it to be the woman who has resisted the patriarchy and fully liberated herself from the male gaze, but the transition from Barbie as object to subject occurs when Barbie recognizes herself as subject-object. And what's funny about this is that even this is rendered in a gag at the very end of the movie. Spoilers for Barbie, but the very, very final shot of Barbie is that Barbie, now emerging as true subject-object in the real world, The first thing that she does is that she goes to a gynecologist. In a sense, what is being hinted at here is that Barbie has grown a vagina. Sorry for being crass about it. This materialization of Barbie, this going from the plastic blob of the indeterminate sexuation, which is of course the plastic blob of the notion of chivalry. The notion of chivalry upholds the idea of feminine sexuality in its pure form that can always be withheld from man and never reached, and therefore idealizing woman precisely as a way of objectifying her. That Barbie's materialization, her embrace of her subjectivity as subject-object, is therefore precisely to have a reproductive organ. And that this reproductive organ, rather than being sort of the object of fetishistic contestation, is precisely the thing in its pure brute material form, which is the aspect or marker of its liberation. And if you think about it, this is the entire discourse about feminism and patriarchy, is not only what is woman in itself, but what is the quote-unquote horrific, traumatic encounter with woman's absence of phallus, woman's reproductive organ, woman's vagina. To go back to the idea, the pitfall, the trap of, the feminine embrace of kindness and, sweetness and authentic femininity, etc. The same is true for all of those more contemporary postmodern embraces of let's talk about vaginas and let's have the vagina monologues and let's take the taboo thing and bring it out to the open. The whole point is that the reason feminine sexuality remains taboo is precisely because it fills in the tension that exists between the incompatibility of sexuation. It's also why Žižek has argued that the perfect date for him would be for a man and a woman to meet, to go up to their bedrooms, for the man, and sorry to be crass here, for a man to grab a dildo and for a woman to grab a fake vagina, to plug them in and to have them screw each other, and that the man and the woman could then go out and have a nice walk through the park together and read a book. This isn't just Žižek being ace, as some people have interpreted. This is not an asexual argument. It's to say that the problem of sexual identification is therefore the problem of the irreducibility of the sexual function to the symbolic function. That the way in which the sexual is attached to the imaginary relationship of the man to his symbolic function in the symbolic order is therefore something which is perceived as a hurdle. And therefore, Barbie's emancipation is not to have gone from the bombshell, sexy, idealized Barbie to the gross, vulgar, physical woman who has real problems in the world, but instead to say that it's the other way around. That Barbie, who is sexy and perfect, is precisely sexless, and that her awakening into subjectivity is when she grows a vagina, quite literally. And that's the beautifully intelligent, funny, final way to end this movie, is to suggest that the materialization of Barbie as divine, sexless, sexy doll is therefore the emancipation of female subjectivity as woman in physical reality with vagina, who is therefore emancipated from this idealized notion of femininity. Again, I'm probably not explaining this very well, and believe me, I'm perfectly aware of the contradictions of having a guy on a YouTube video or an Instagram video talking declaratively about Barbie and feminism and psychoanalysis. The point of this video, however, was to try to bring into focus some Lacanian concepts apropos his theory of sexuation, the symbolic function of the phallus, as well as some of Žižek's arguments about ideology and how they interrelate. And I think that what makes Barbie such a successful movie is that it's able to not educate the audience, but bring them into multiple different attitudes towards and within feminism in a way that seems entirely not pedantic and not theoretical and not heavy-handed. Hence also why I think it's perfect that it's done not as some indie movie or some feminist lecture that nobody would go to, but instead as a piece of commercial property, as a piece of entertainment. And it's not simply to say that all entertainment is art. It's to say that one of the best ways to critique ideology is to do it from within. Not to take this pseudo-philosophical, pretentious intellectual stance of I exist outside the system and I'm talking about it critically, but to go right into the mouth of the lion as such, which is what Barbie essentially does and accomplishes. And I have to say that I went into this movie a little bit concerned that it was going to be much more politically correct, that it was going to be a kind of virtue signaling exercise. And I was very pleased to see just how intelligent and informed and sort of contradictory a lot of the positions were. I thought it was a beautiful movie. And so I highly recommend that you watch it. That is Barbie, the movie, and some of the philosophical psychoanalytic components about Barbie. If you'd like to talk more about this with me, I'm going to be hosting a Q&A discussion right now, or in 5 minutes, on Discord, which you can also download as a members-only podcast for subscribers on Substack and on Patreon. I would also like to remind you that my ebook, The Complete Guide to Žižek, which is a collection of my previous 8 volumes on Žižek, which runs to about 800 pages, can now be downloaded exclusively on Patreon. And so if you'd like to download my ebook, please go to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. And of course, I will save these lectures here, open access them for free on both Instagram and YouTube. Thank you to all the patrons who allow this project to keep on existing. And I will see you in about 5 minutes. See you guys.